Well, hi, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 49. I kid you not, of Shelf Analysis. I know every time I always manage to make myself sound slightly shocked at the fact that the number has gone up by one, and that's how numbers work when they're happening in an ascending sequence. Episode 49 of Shelf Analysis tonight. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Rick O'Shea. How are you? If this is your very first one, fantastic. There are a few better places we could be starting than tonight on Shelf Analysis. We'll tell you a little bit about what is coming up over the next few weeks on the series as well, and then get to tonight's guest. Again, just to warn you, one of my dogs is next to me here on the bed, sleeping. There have been a lot of fireworks in our particular part of Dublin, and pretty much in every part of Dublin, over the space of the last, 4 months. So on the off chance there's a particularly loud one, he might not like it. And I am taking a calculated risk by allowing him to be here tonight. But he seems perfectly happy right now. So I'm just letting you know in case that were to happen a little bit later on. A couple of pieces of business to let you know about in terms of things that have happened and are happening and things I would like you to know about. Let's do this one first. If you missed it at the weekend, she was fantastic. We did a bonus episode of Shelf Analysis over the weekend with the wonderful Elizabeth Day. You might know her from How to Fail, the book, or from the wonderful How to Fail podcast as well. And of course, she is now one of the co-presenters of Sky Art's new book series on TV as well. She has a new book out called Philosophy. There it is. And I talked to her, I'll be honest with you, mostly about interview technique. We spent a lot of time talking about interview technique. And then we talked a little bit about failure and about books and about stuff that she loves. It's well worth your time. It went out on Bank Holiday Monday on the YouTube channel. If you don't normally watch on YouTube and you just watch in the Ricochet Book Club, go and check out the Shelf Analysis YouTube channel. You will find that there. I promise you, well worth your time. It's a fantastic 30 minutes worth of chatology. As well as that, I don't have the graphic for this week. So look, I'm going to do two things. This is the graphic for The Book Show, the episode from last Sunday on RTE Radio 1 with Jenny Offal. I spoke to her about weather, about finding the humor in climate catastrophe, and a lot of other things, including contemporary US politics. We also had on Paul Howard talking to a book club from Kerry about the Russell Carroll Kelly series. And then Stephanie Preisner and I ended up discussing the nature of to-be-read shelves, which in her case, she believes each to-be-read pile is something between about 5 and about 9 books. And I have 101 because I counted them before I had the chat with her. So that's last week's book show from RTE Radio 1. It is, of course, available as a podcast now, wherever you get yours. You can have a listen to that. This coming weekend on the book show on Radio 1, I'm going to have, let me make sure I get this right. I'm talking to two alumni of Shelf Analysis, who I spoke to earlier in the year. Sean Bethel from the Wigtown Bookshop in Scotland is going to be my guest on the book show this coming weekend on Radio 1. And we have a book club in Offaly talking to Anne Griffin. Stephanie and I will be talking horror books, books that scare you, books that maybe scare you, books that are supposed to scare you and don't, given the weekend that's in it. And that will be coming this coming Sunday on RTE Radio 1 at 7 o'clock as usual. And of course, the podcast goes out this coming Friday afternoon. Episode 49. Tonight of Shelf Analysis. I didn't realize that when we arranged this, it's just coincidental, I promise, but we're hitting episode 50 this weekend, and it is another bonus episode. So the only place you can get this is on the YouTube channel. Just look up Shelf Analysis on YouTube if you don't normally watch there, our episode. And I'm doing it at a slightly unusual time as well, because we had a lot of people suggesting this might work out better for them. So I'm going to look, we're going to try it. If it doesn't work for you, remember, you can watch the episode at any time you like. But this weekend, episode 50 of Shelf Analysis, I will be talking to the legendary John Banville. That's this coming Saturday, 3 p.m. Saturday afternoon on the Shelf Analysis YouTube channel. It's episode 50, and I'll be talking to John Banville as well. Of course, if you can't watch Saturday at 3, you'll be able to catch it at any stage after that on the YouTube channel. And the same goes for all of our episodes as well. I've talked for a whole 5 minutes. That's enough. If you have questions for our guest tonight, remember you can stick them in comments either below if you're watching live now on the Ricochet Book Club or on the YouTube channel as well. If you're watching later or you're watching on RTE Culture, lovely to have you. You can't ask questions because that's not how linear time works. Our guest tonight is a man whose first book I read, and I wasn't sure what to expect of it, read and adored it as so many people did. Ended up becoming one of those books that people talked about. He has a second book out just now this year as well. The author of The Cow Book and The Running Book. I should, if I press this button, be able to say, hello, John Connell. How are you?
Hello, Rick O'Shea, and hello to everybody watching. It's great to be here. I don't know how you keep doing it, Rick, but keep delivering fantastic shows. Seems to be every second day.
It is absolutely cloning. I swear there's more than one of me. That's how it works. Either that or I'm just work obsessed. It could be one of the two.
Well, work makes pleasure.
It does. In this case, it does. Anyway, how are you? It's been a while since I've seen you in the real world, although we do speak a little on social media. Tell me, firstly, before we get into any of this, how this year has treated you, how everything that we've all been going through has affected you, and how you've been living your life over the last few months.
So, well, look, Rick, it's been a really interesting year. I started the year on a research trip in America, working with migrant agricultural workers along the US border. And I suppose the scenes I saw there were terrible. I met a man who was 83 years old, who was a Mexican day laborer, who had no pension and had no social security because he was illegal, and he was going to be working till he died, he told me. And I met young Indigenous kids from Central America of about 12 years of age who were working in the fields in America. So that was a serious reality check for me. And then I had a meeting with Netflix, which was just really weird to have the two things together in America. And then I came home and went to bed for a week, and my wife texted me and she said there's a lockdown coming. So pretty much that was it. And I've had a rather interesting time. I had long thought about finishing this trilogy of their books, the Longford trilogy, as I call it. So I ended up going down the local river on a canoe with Peter Keegan, who's a Longford born journalist who's just a Sunday Times bestseller with his book about Brexit and dark money at the moment. And that has formed the last book, which has been really, I'd put it off for ages. And I suppose if lockdown hadn't have come, I never would have done it. So I spent the whole summer writing and then farming. So I suppose I've been lucky in that I have the farm, that I was able to leave the house and travel past the 5K perimeter. And so I spent the summer at that, and then I did a lot of running. Great.
You can't just throw into conversation, oh, and then I met Netflix, and just skim over it like that's nothing. Is there anything you want to tell us? What was happening there?
Oh, I've been working on a kids' TV show for a long time called Mr. Crocodile. And we had a meeting with them, and it went really well, but because of COVID, it's all kind of up in the air. So there's not much to report there, unfortunately. I worked on it when I lived in Australia, and it's been a project that's been dear to my heart for a number of years. So I suppose if anyone's watching and who have been working on a project for a long time, I've really learned this lesson in the last few years, that sometimes it's not about the project, it's about the person that you're meeting. It's as important to meet the receiver on the right end. And I know from the publishing world that it's the same there. You could send out a book to 10 different people and get 9 rejections, but all you need is that one yes. So it's been it's been a really, I've learned that lesson in the last few years, and I've really taken it to heart.
And just for those people maybe who don't know, and I don't know, although I've heard you mention it before, about the Migrant Worker Project. What is that? Is that for a book, or is that something else?
It's for a book. Look, Rick, it's all, I can't do it at the moment because of COVID, but I was supposed to be in the Amazon in Brazil in the summertime. I'm looking at a global project about migrant workers in agriculture and the conditions they face. I suppose I was an investigative journalist before I was a writer, and to be honest, it all kind of started because of Willie Nelson.
How many people have started sentences like that? It all started because of
yeah. The cow book came out in America, and Willie Nelson is a co-founder of a charity and a festival called Farm Aid, and we sent the book to Willie's people, and we sent the book to Willie, and I had talked to them about I might want to look at this, and they handed me to a group called the Rural Coalition, who actually organized the whole trip, a month-long trip that went across all of America, and they paid for flights and everything. And so that was to be the first place I was going to go to. And then I've been working with Open Democracy in the UK. They have an office in Brazil, to go down to the Amazon, because what's happening there, it's a totally different picture to what's happening in America, in that there is modern slavery on beef farms in Brazil, and obviously they're clearing the rainforest to make way for these beef farms, and they're getting involved rather sadly with Indigenous people and killing Indigenous people over land rights. And that was to be a project that was going to take up all of this year. I suppose I wanted to do it because the Cow Book had been such a success, and rural people had wrote to me from around the world, and they were having so many issues where they lived in different places. And I just I felt like I had a responsibility to do it, because I had a voice in agriculture now, and that was the reason. But sadly, because of COVID, we're going to have to leave it for a little while, because otherwise every chapter would be about farming and COVID. So hopefully when this thing lifts, and who knows when that'll be, but I'll be making my way to Brazil.
Okay, and that all kind of doesn't really lead us into the
No.
new book, but this is your job, is to segue seamlessly into telling us a little bit, firstly about the running book, and then about why write this.
Yeah, well, I suppose it does kind of in a weird way lead into the running book, because a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is modern colonialism, economic colonialism, and the running book, as well as being a book about running, is about colonialism and empire and economies and taking advantage of people. The Cow Book had been such a success that I had thought, what will I write next? And I had actually wrote this book shortly after, a year after writing the Cow Book in 2016. And running had been a way for me to get a hold on my mental health, which had been something I've spoken about in the media, and people probably know that about me. But the book is dedicated to Stephen Ray, and Stephen and I talk about a lot of this stuff all the time. And it seems a strange bedfellow to put history and running together. But when I started to examine it, I went to Spain to write it, and then to LA, and I had been watching the documentaries of Adam Curtis. And if anyone hasn't seen Adam Curtis's work, he makes these amazing film essays for the BBC. And from what I understand, he just gets carte blanche to the BBC archives, and he makes what he wants. And he did one about the power of, I think it was called The Power of Nightmares. And it was about the construction of World War II, the narrative of World War II, but also I'd been watching a documentary called After Sebald, which was about W.G. Sebald, who wrote The Rings of Saturn. And it was kind of a book in a Sebald-esque fashion about the stories that we create, but also an examination of different topics. All in Sebald's work, he went for a walk in the English countryside, and in my case, I went for a run through North Longford. And it was a way to examine the global history of one place, but also to show that every place has a story. And in exploring the roots of history in Longford, I was showing, I suppose, the thread of storytelling around the world. And so I went from talking about Thoreau to a baseball player from Granard in Longford, which people would know about from Anne Lovett, who Walt Whitman would have seen play baseball. So it was all these amazing stories and connections. And I had always grown up loving history. So that was a way to do that. And I suppose it was a bit of a literary gamble to write something like this.
But if we didn't take gambles, then there'd be an awful lot of books in the world that that should be out there, and that never would have made it in the first place unless people were willing to roll that dice in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny. I've done quite a few interviews this month, and people have said to me, "Oh, you must have been clairvoyant to know that we'd all be running in COVID, and gyms are closed, and people are so in love with going for a walk and movement now that it's kind of it's a really interesting time to have a book out that's about a celebration of running, but also a celebration of life. And ultimately, the book is about how, for one person, happiness came through the feet. And I think, it's following on from the tradition of Thoreau, who is a writer that I greatly admire. He would have went for really long walks near Walden Pond, and that was something that I did.
I think sometimes people don't want to hear the answer. It's just blind luck that I was writing about it and it came out right now.
Oh God, it was totally blind luck.
Nobody wants to hear that answer, but nonetheless, look, we're kind of, again, allegedly, the very thin string on which I've hung all of these conversations with people that I want to talk to is books that you love and that you think that other people should have a look at. So what have you got for me tonight, and where would you like to start?
Okay, so I've never done this before, and I was telling my wife just before we started that it has made me realize, in compiling books that I want people to know about and books that have deeply affected me, it's actually shown me why I'm the writer I am, and that was the really interesting thing. And a lot of it was nonfiction, so it came as no surprise, I suppose, that I wrote 3 nonfiction works. I suppose I'm going to start with a book that nobody in Ireland will have heard of. It's called Darky, New Black Seeds. It's by an Aboriginal historian and writer called Bruce Pascoe. Darky New was published a few years ago, and it's a farming book, but it's a history book. It's about reframing the narrative about Aboriginal agriculture and aquaculture in Australia. In Australia, they have a thing, and to preface this, I spent a number of years in Australia growing up as a 20-something-year-old. I spent 6 years there, and I met my wife there. And I was involved in Indigenous affairs as an investigative journalist. But Pascoe's book is amazing because in Australia, there's a thing called the History Wars. And it's the reframing of the narrative by extremists from usually the right and nationalist front, who say that Australia was a terra nullius. It was a vacant land. It was an empty land, that Aboriginal people had no forms of society. They were just hunter-gatherers wandering around the desert. What Bruce Pascoe does is use the explorers' diaries and words and letters to show that Australia was anything but a terra nullius. In fact, there was large agriculture happening, there was aquaculture happening, and he even goes to show that the very first bakers of bread were Aboriginal people. Bread is believed to have been discovered, to have been invented in ancient Egypt, but actually in his book he shows that it was invented 30,000 years ago by Aboriginal women. The really interesting thing about, and really sad thing, I suppose, is he tells the story of Stewart's Stony Desert, where 2 brothers are setting out to find new land to colonize. And they end up in Stewart's Stony Desert in central Australia, and they're dying. And they crawl, and they're properly in the desert, and they're crawling above the sand. And then they come upon this Aboriginal village, and there's mills and granaries and stone houses, which people always think Aboriginal people lived in lean-tos. There's stone houses and milling stones, and the people take the explorers and feed them wild duck and bread cake, and they bring them back to life. And the amazing thing is the explorer writes this beautiful letter and says that we were treated with civility and custom, and it was like an English village, and they had come by miles of fields of wheat and barley, or indigenous wheat and barley. And but the really fucked thing, to pardon my French, is that his brother was riding a couple of miles behind him, pegging out the land to mark out the areas they were going to take over. And the reason that people believe that Australia is a terra nullius is because there's no houses, but the houses were the stone was taken from them to build settler homes. So everything was erased. And he even then talks about, and this to me is fascinating, and it's recorded again by white historians, and he's just pointing out what white historians and white writers had said, was that there was Aboriginal tribes who had animal relationships, and they were working. There was an Aboriginal tribe in southern Australia who worked with killer whales to hunt minke whales. I think it was minke whales or sperm whales, and that they were working in unison together, and that the hunters then the killer whales would bring the animals into shore. They would cut off the tongue, give it to the killer whales, and this practice had continued for millennia until a white settler came along, saw what was happening, and shot the first killer whale, and thereby ending the whole relationship. The killer whales never came back. It's an absolutely, I don't have the book to show people because I got an audiobook. It's an absolutely fascinating book. It's sold thousands and thousands of copies in Australia. Bruce Pascoe encountered a lot of trouble. He's actually Irish Aboriginal, as a lot of Aboriginal people in Australia are. They have Irish surnames and everything. And he was labelled last year as not Aboriginal because he's white-skinned, and he got into a lot of trouble from the right-wing groups, but he's an amazing man. There's a documentary on the way about the book, and I'm talking about this a lot, but it's so good. The one thing he does talk about is that the crops that were grown in Australia were climate change resistant, and now he has a research project where they're growing these crops for the first time in 200 years, and they could be the very future food that we're all going to be eating.
It's obvious just how passionate you are about this, and that's what makes it such an interesting thing. Remind me of the title of the book again. So it's Bruce Pascoe, and it's
Bruce Pascoe, Pascoe, Darky New Black Seeds. It's brilliant. It's
Darky New Black Seeds. Okay.
Yeah, I got it on audiobook. So.
Okay. Emily says, once again, Rick, you have brought me to a writer I probably wouldn't have come to organically, but now I can't wait to go out and get his books. You've only been here 5 minutes and already you've made books. Hello to Moira, who says the cow book is wonderful. The lovely Moira Log from down Listowel. Tell me, what else have you got for book number 2 then? Where are you going to go with that?
Okay, so this one's I'll go to let me see now. Yeah, I'll go to this writer here. I've got a big list of 10 books. We probably won't get to them all. John Berger was an art historian and a writer. He won the Booker Prize. It would be fair to say that I wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for John Berger. I read I studied in DCU, and I didn't particularly like DCU, but I did a sociology class there. And I came across his writings, particularly his book Ways of Seeing, which was an art theory book, and he did a BBC series about it as well. And it was about how we look at art and why we look at art. But what I did, that spurred me on to a huge interest in Berger. And after Berger won the Booker Prize, he gave half his money to the British Black Panthers and used the other half to write a book called A Seventh Man, which was an examination of migrant workers who were Gastarbeiter aus Deutsch, who had come from Turkey to work in Germany. But he moved to the French Alps and he wrote a trilogy of books called the Pigger Trilogy. And they're all fiction stories. They were informed by the peasant people he worked with. He called them peasants, but really, I suppose in Ireland we just call them farmers. And the books are absolutely exquisite. I remember in college in Dublin going up to Hodges Figgis by Trinity College, and I discovered the first book, then I got the second book, and then I got the third book, and reading them all. And they were absolutely fantastic. His style of writing is so good, and my writing career began with a short story called The Little Black, which was about a cow and who gave birth to a little calf. And I wrote it when I was homesick in Australia. And I had in college in Sydney, I had got a collection of his essays, which was like edited by Jeff Dwyer, I don't know how to pronounce that. And it was about this thick. And it just fundamentally made me rethink how to write, about language, about why we look at things. And I keep returning to, and I talked about it in the cow book, I keep returning to his book About Looking, and he has an essay in it, Why We Look at Animals. And he talks about the gaze that we share with animals and how at first it was one of mutual respect and awe, particularly for wild creatures, and why we painted them on the caves in Nassau and other places, but that now it has been replaced with animals in a zoo who are no longer wild, and we observe them, but they don't observe us, and we deny them the right to look at us. And I suppose animals, as a farmer, have been a key part of my life from growing up to returning to the land. So Berger was someone who has continually left a deep impression on me. And when I lived in Canada, I actually wrote to him and I said, you inspired me. And he wrote back. And I've always treasured that postcard. And I was really sad to hear when he died in 2017. He was an amazing writer. And I think people should look him up. He's fantastic.
So you're not just recommending one John Berger book. Everything he has ever written is
everything he has ever written. I mean, I probably wouldn't be writing this migrant worker thing if I hadn't read A Seventh Man. If you're into art, which I am, you should read Ways of Seeing, and then About Looking is fantastic. And if you like rural pastoral literature, then the Pig Earth trilogy is fantastic. I haven't read all his books, but those are some, and there's documentaries on YouTube about him and everything. He's a cool dude. Like, he was best friends with Tilda Swinton, so that tells you how cool he was.
In which case, that immediately gives it the seal of approval that we require on this particular program. Fair play. Okay, where are we going next after that? What else have we got?
Okay, I'm going to go with an Irish writer and someone whose voice I absolutely love. I didn't study literature, I studied journalism. And I came back to Ireland in 2011 and I had a book contract from a publisher in Sydney to write a book. And I was writing an Irish book, which ultimately flopped, never even came out in Ireland. But I kind of had to go and read the back catalogue of Irish literature, and no easy task. But I came upon, to my delight, Edna O'Brien. And I was listening to the BBC, and she was being interviewed on Arts and Ideas on BBC Radio 3 about her short story collection, Saints and Sinners. And there was a story in that called Shovel Kings, which I subsequently read, that she went and talked to old Irish builders and labourers in London, in Hackney, and in some of the areas where the Irish live. And she wrote the story of this man who had worked as a shovel king. That's what they call themselves. They were, the tunnel tigers who had worked on the buildings in the 50s. And she tells the story of this old man who has no money, and he ends up coming back to Ireland under the promise that he has to mind a relation, but it doesn't work out for him, and he comes back to London. And it showed me, so often we think of emigration as a great thing, as a positive thing. You're learning new stuff, but we discount the London Irish, the British Irish who went overseas, and oftentimes life wasn't better and it was harder. And we owe those people who went to Britain so much. It's been often remarked about the billions that they sent home that kept the Irish economy afloat in the 50s, and we kind of abandoned them. And I'd never really read much about that time until I read that short story, and the whole collection was brilliant. And then last summer, I spent a month fencing on the farm, and I listened to the audiobook of Country Girl, Edna's autobiography, when I was working, and her voice is just like honey. I just absolutely love listening to her. And I was supposed to meet her once in London, and it didn't work out. And hopefully I'll get to meet her eventually when all this is over. But she's rightly like one of our greatest ever writers. And when eventually that poster is made of famous Irish writers, she will be there. Not the male skewed one that's just all the old guys. Edna deserves to be there.
That's just an old tea towel at this point. That's long since gone from. No, it's probably still being sold somewhere in tour.
In pubs in New York and stuff. Ridiculous.
Edna O'Brien, super lovely, great, and still writing to this day, and even had a book.
Yeah, girl, yeah.
As well, yeah, which is just astonishing. Okay, continue with me. Where are we going next? What have you got?
Okay, so I'm going to change tack here, and I'm going to recommend plays. I read plays a lot. Okay. And people wouldn't know that about me, but I've just finished a play, and I got a commission to write a new play. And there's two writers who I absolutely love. One is Sam Shepard, and this is borrowed from a library in Dublin. I'm really sorry, it will get returned. It was sent down to Longford Library. It's due back. I do know that there is clemency at the moment, so if anyone's watching this, it is going back.
No, hang on. When you say it came from a library in Dublin and ended up in Longford, how long ago?
They requested it for me.
This isn't 12 years ago or anything.
Oh no, this was last summer. But
okay, right.
But Sam Shepard was phenomenal. And I would have seen Curse of the Starving Class. I came back to Ireland 5 years ago, and I started going to the theatre a lot. And the really wonderful thing about the theatre in Ireland is, which people don't realise, is it's heavily supported by the Arts Council. So theatre prices are quite cheap. When I was in Sydney in Australia, and when I lived in Toronto in Canada, going to the theatre was like $150 a fare. You can go and see a world-class play with a Hollywood actor if you want for about €30 in Ireland. So it's fantastic. I saw Curse of the Starving Class and I kind of never looked back. And I got this book, and it was really weird. I was at WOMAD Festival in England, and I brought the play with me. I brought this book with me. I was speaking for BBC Radio 4, and I was reading True West. And I looked up, and it was actually the day that Sam Shepard had died. He'd been 2 years dead. So I was like, wow, I really meant to be reading this. True West is the story of two brothers. One is trying to write a script for Hollywood, and the other brother is kind of a loafer and a waster. And he starts to get involved with writing the script and comes up with these different ideas. And then in the end, this producer comes from LA. I think they're out in the sticks in California. And this producer comes from LA, and he actually likes the Loafer brothers' idea instead, and the other brother just loses the plot. Sam he obviously did Kicking a Dead Horse with Stephen Ray, which is phenomenal. Again, to me, there was a pivotal moment in that scene where he talks about, I think it's Sitting Bull or Geronimo, and he just stops. And in the notes for the script, it says, actor to read this in his own voice, and he says, why don't we remember this man? Why is there not a day for this man? And it's kind of questioning the whole notion of America. And in that play, Stephen's character is he's a drifter again, and he's a guy who got into the art world by picking up pieces for really cheap and selling them and making a lot of money. And he's got this dead horse and he's trying to bury it. But really, it's about the American dream and the fallacy of it all. And it's just. He's brilliant. He's brilliant.
I had that moment once, which I regret eternally, of standing in the same bar as Sam Shepard and not having the balls to go up and say, I really love what you do. And it was in the Peacock in Dublin. It was for one of the plays that he'd done. I'm not sure whether it was Flogging a Dead Horse, because Stephen Ray was in whichever play. In the Peacock, and it was opening night and he was in the bar. Did I? Nope, not at all, because that's just the way I am. But sure,
Yeah, his loss is a tremendous one. I mean, he was phenomenal.
I think we're also one of the few people who started recommending play scripts, which is great. We haven't really had a lot of that. We've had poetry, certainly. We've had a lot of that over the course of the series.
Yeah,
but not really. What else have we got?
Okay, from one play to another, I got to do this one as well. Brian Friel is absolutely one of my favorite playwrights in the world. I even have a tattoo from Philadelphia, Here I Come, that says it's here. It says it's all over and it's all about to begin.
What I love, is that means 2 shelf analyses in a row where we've had authors show us their tattoos without me asking, which I think is a good run to be on.
I couldn't say it and then not show it.
Well, no, this is true. And I'm also wondering if we'll make it a hat trick at the weekend with John Banville, but I don't think so.
You don't know. John might have something. Okay, Friel. Again, I would have in coming back to Ireland. I was going to the Abbey. And I suppose before that, actually, RTE, for Brian Friel's 70th, they dramatised all his plays for radio. And I was living in Sydney, and I used to, every so often I'd get homesick and I'd listen to programmes from RTE. And I remember saying this to, I think it's Kevin Powers, I think is the drama guy at RT. And I said, I met him years later, and I said, you saved my life. And he was like, what are you talking about? And I said, you made those plays. They weren't geo-blocked. Like, I could listen to them in Australia. So I listened to Philadelphia, Here I Come. And of course, I was living Gar's life. I had went overseas, and I knew what it was about. And I think I knew, in a sense, what Gar's worry was, that particularly when he meets his relations, that life is oftentimes not better over there, and that you're going. Obviously, I had a great time, and there was loads of opportunities, but it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And then I suppose going from Philadelphia, Here I Come, I started to go through his back catalogue, and I really think that one of his best plays ever was Faith Healer. The really interesting thing was Faith Healer was a flop. It didn't actually succeed at the box office, even though it's considered a masterpiece now. And I think the Abbey are talking about doing it again with Aidan Gillen. I think so, or it could be the National. I can't remember. And obviously, I think his other one, Translations, was on at the National Theatre last year, and a friend of mine was in that. I think Friel captured the rural, but also the universal. And he wasn't also afraid to talk about what was happening in Northern Ireland. And I think when Field Day in the 80s went round and toured all those rural theatres, like they did Translations at the Derry City Guildhall, and John Hume was there, and Seamus Heaney was there. Of course, Seamus was in Field Day. They brought theatre to people in places where theatre hadn't been accessible. And I suppose people would know that about me, but I've always loved acting and drama. So, and I used to do acting when I was a kid. And Friel rightly is the master, and he was called the Irish Chekhov. And I think if it wasn't for Brian Friel, there wouldn't be modern Irish drama. So much of the canon is his work. And from Shepard to Friel, I think Shepard was influenced by Friel.
I think even just harking back to the Abbey again, I think I saw Translations there 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and there was an extraordinary production of it done there as well. I also think there should be a self-help group for the likes of us who were actors when we were in our childhood or teenage years and just never really grew out. And here we are. Here we are doing what we're doing right now.
Company of actors, they're great. It's a fascinating life. And a friend of mine, actually, the guy who said it is Zia Haider Rahman. He wrote a book called In the Light of What We Know. It won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and it's about post 9/11 world. But he said a really interesting thing to me a few years ago. He said, the thing about actors is you can't do your job without other people watching you. I was like, yeah, you're totally right. You have to be seen to do your job, or heard if it's audio.
Or else you're just talking to yourself in your house.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is not really the same thing. I'm loving the selection, the choices so far. Where else are you going to take us? What have we got?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about someone who, this isn't on my list, but it's someone who had a huge influence on me. David Malouf is an Australian writer. David won the first Impact Prize for Remembering Babylon. David was my mentor when I was a young writer, and he's still alive. We talk every few weeks. I'm just currently reading his book 12 Edmonton Street, which is the story of his life told through his house in Brisbane in Australia. David is a very classical writer. He speaks Italian and French, and I think a little bit of Greek. He grew up in Brisbane. He's gay. He's just a fascinating writer. His book, An Imaginary Life, is the one that really launched him, and it was a novella that was an imagining of Ovid's banishment from Rome, where he goes to Eastern Europe. And it was actually a book about, I was reading up on this today, it's actually a book about a commentary on Indigenous affairs in Australia, because he makes friends with the wild boy, and it was at a time when people were attacking the Indigenous situation. He just, I suppose I wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for David, and I'm still kind of going through all his work. He's just covered so much. He also writes poetry. I suppose if people were to start with a book, I wouldn't say An Imaginary Life because it's a little bit complex, but Remembering Babylon is probably a really great one, which is about a white child who is taken in by an Aboriginal tribe and then comes back in contact with settler society and is is not accepted by them. He's brilliant, and he rightly won the Booker or the Impact Prize when it was first done. I couldn't have thought of anyone else to recommend it to, and it was through David that I got to know Colm Tobin, and Colm actually blurbed the cow book because I said to him, "Remember me, I'm David Malouf's friend." So
you'll take the blurbs any way you can get them. Do you remember me? I'd love.
Yeah. Okay, next book. I'm conscious that we've got a limited amount of time.
Well, insofar as that we're both going to die eventually, yes, we've a limited amount of time. Beyond that, though, not really. We're not on anybody's time clock here. You fire ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. For another Irish writer who I absolutely love is Claire Keegan. Claire is primarily a short story writer. I don't think she's wrote a novel. No, I don't think so. She's wrote a novella called Foster, and people wouldn't know this about me, but my family fostered kids when I was young, and her novella Foster, it's really interesting. Every so often it appears again on the bestseller list. I don't know if it's been studied in school or not, but if you look every year, there's a couple of weeks where it comes right back up. It's a book that describes a young girl who is taken in by a farming family, and the girl makes a bond with the dad, who's the farmer, and it's the story of them falling in love with each other. And initially, the father's quite reticent to take her in and doesn't really want to, I suppose, fall for her. And I know this from my own life. Kids can come and go, and it can be really tricky. And the book ends with the child leaving the family, and it's just totally heartbreaking. And then that brought me on to read Walk the Blue Fields, which is her short story collection. And I think the first story in that, Walk the Blue Fields, is about a priest who is having an affair with a girl who is getting married. And it was actually a priest who recommended it to me, my parish priest. And it is probably one of the most beautiful and devastating modern short stories that I've ever read. It's such an incredible story. And he goes to this Chinese healer who says to him, "What's your problem?" That's all the English he can say. He goes, "What's your problem? What's your problem?" And he goes, "Oh, I can't say." And he heals him, and the guy leaves, and I think it's nighttime coming into dawn, and the fields are blue, and he's walking the blue fields. It's phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. Claire I think she was the writer in residence at Trinity this year. I hope she's got a new work coming out. It's been a little while. She's if people aren't familiar with her, like, her fiction has been published in the New Yorker and everything. She's just streets ahead of so many people.
You are covering broad ground here, and it's getting broader the further we go, which I love. Okay, go on. Well, give us at least one or two more then. What else have you got?
Okay. This one I only read this year. It's Indian Country by Peter Mathiasson. Peter Mathiasson. So I should preface this with another book. Sorry about this, everybody. I listened to the audiobook, actually, of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown, which is the true story of the American West. And it's about the demise of all the major Native American tribes in the push west. And I was listening to that book on tape in America in 2017 when I was writing the running book, and I was on my way to go and meet the vice president of the Navajo Nation, Jonathan Prez. And I listened to the book, and there was a massive chapter on the Navajo, and it was all about how it's the first chapter actually of the book, and it's about how the Navajo are the only tribe really to ever regain their nation. And their nation, if you didn't know it, it's in the running book. It's the same size as Ireland, and 500,000 people live there. And right now they're having huge problems with COVID, which loads of Irish people donated money. We might remember that from the lockdown. It was a couple of million raised. But I'd been there, and the weird thing was the priest who I mentioned, the parish priest, he actually, I said to him, I'm going to meet the Navajo when I go and write this book. And he said, why are you going to do that? I said, I have no idea. I said, I just feel like I need to meet the Navajo. I'm just being guided to do this. And he said, hang on a second. And he went upstairs, came back down with a letter from a relation of mine who was a priest who had lived with the Navajo. And in the letter, it's one of the most beautiful letters I need to find it. It's one of the most beautiful letters that I've ever read. And in it, he talks about how the Navajo and the Irish are very similar. And it's in the running book. And let me just find it. He says, and this is Father Frank Gray, who's based in County Leitrim, I think. He's still alive. He says, the Navajos don't seem to have an innate desire to master nature. This comes from an inherited caution and respect. Like the ancient Celts, they lavish their skills and endless patience into works of art, weaving, jewellery, making pottery. The landscape is wild and free, mostly desert with red and blue rocky mountains and a little group of houses here and there vanishing into the landscape, not standing out against it. It is the Indian way to want to pass through life without disturbing anything. The spirit of the earth, air and water are to be respected, and the land and all it bears are treated with consideration. Corn, the fruit of the land, is sacred to the Navajo. They use it like holy water. In the morning at prayer, a devout Navajo holds a pinch of it in his hand. When finished praying, he sprinkles it on his path, puts a little pinch of it on top of his head for good luck, and tastes it for good harmony. And then the really weird thing that happened was, I didn't know, running is a sacred act to the Navajo, and they start every day with a run. So I was like, my mind was blown.
You're like, I'm supposed to be here. And you haven't even gotten to the Peter Mathiasson book yet,
No,
which is allegedly where we started.
We're going to this one. So Dee Brown's book finishes with the Battle of Wounded Knee, and effectively she's just saying, well, that's the end of Native American people. And there have been other writers and Native American Indigenous writers have now wrote about it. But Peter Mathiasson, who wrote an amazing book called The Snow Leopard, which I have here, which Michael Wood, the BBC historian, gave to me. I haven't read it yet. It's supposed to be amazing. But I picked this up when I was in America with the Group the Rural Coalition. I was staying in one of their houses, and it was the leader's son's book. And in the 1970s, he went to visit the Native American tribes mostly in the West, in the Midwest. But he also tells the story of the Muskoka Indians who live in Florida. And of course, in February, I was in Florida, and we went through the Muskoka are the Seminole people, and it told the story of how this small tribe had resisted violently against U.S. occupation, and amazingly, they're the only tribe in the eastern part of America. They've retained their language, they retained their culture. They have never signed a treaty because they've never given up their land. And there's been huge ongoing disputes and legal cases still happening to this day because they don't want, even though they were going to be given hundreds of thousands of acres, and US presidents up until the 1950s and 60s were getting involved in this. And they said, no, we don't want, this was the amazing thing. They said, we can't own the earth because we are of the earth. So they were saying, we can't take a piece of paper to say this is ours because it's not ours, but it's equally not yours. And I was traveling through these towns, and I remember I was in Immokalee in Florida, and the Muskoka have a couple of, there was a split, there's two tribes now, and they've got a couple of casinos, but they still They still speak their language, and the tribe dwindled down to like a handful of people, and they've built up their numbers again, and they're just really inspiring. And then in the book, he talks about the Navajo and the Hopi Nation, and the Hopi Nation is in the 1960s. That's where the counterculture movement came, and the idea of the vision quest and speakers and messages came from the Hopi, and they said that it was they had received a spirit guide to. This sounds really hippie, but it's quite true. And they said that they had received messages to educate people, and that they hoped that by getting involved in the counterculture movement, they would advance land rights and Indigenous rights for Native Americans. Fascinating. It's a brilliant book. I don't know how easily it is to get in Ireland. I know the Snow Leopard, you could get it in Eason's or Hodges Figures, but Peter Mathiasson is an amazing writer, and he writes about nature so well. And the book I just finished is a nature book. So he's just this changed my life. I only read it a few months ago.
What I love is that you do seem to, there's a thread through everything that you've spoken to tonight that in some way, as you say yourself, leads to where you are as a writer today, right now, and that's quite lovely, and it's quite a particularly given that it's something you yourself said you didn't necessarily realize was happening when you were putting together this list.
Yeah, that was I suppose, Rick, that was the really amazing thing. I realized that in putting together this list, I realized two things. One, that I was really influenced by my time in Australia. There's a couple of different books I have here, and my wife's Australian, and I was saying to her that I suppose in a way I was very much influenced by my time in Australia, and kind of I'm a permanent resident there. I suppose I'm Irish Australian at this point. But I suppose I went there at a pivotal time in my 20s. So, I actively integrated into the society and read their literature and watched the films and documentaries. So it had a huge impression on me. And then also this non-fiction thread. And I didn't realize it till this evening. Apart from the theatre works, which I absolutely love, most of these books are non-fiction. But in a way, it keeps going back to the same themes of land, spirituality, which I'm very much interested in, but also Indigenous rights and colonization. So it kind of, if people read the running book, they'll realize all of that stuff is in the running book.
Yeah, thank you to Gay, who sent us a message saying, I think John would be a great dinner party guest if we had dinner parties, which of course is obviously not a thing that we're allowed to do right now.
Dinner party.
The book is The Running Book. It is out right now, and this has been as fascinating as I had hoped it would be. John Connell, listen, thanks a million for taking the time out tonight, man, in between all of your work on the actual farm, doing the real work every day. And fair play to you, and thanks a million for coming on.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Cheers. Thanks, John. Good luck.
Bye.
I'm now thinking that I've missed a trick over the course of previous episodes of not asking authors about where their tattoos are. That's 2 episodes in a row. You and I both know that it's not going to be a hat trick with John Banville. It's just not. Nonetheless, Shelf Analysis, episode 50. We reached the half century with John Banville. It's this Saturday. It's a bonus episode this Saturday, October 31st, Halloween at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. You can watch it at any stage, of course, after that on the YouTube channel if you fancy it. But that's episode 50. Don't forget, if you are reading the Irish Independent this coming Saturday, the Independent review section every weekend now has little bit just devoted to what's coming up on Shelf Analysis the following week. They will be talking about next Wednesday's Shelf Analysis. Sorry, lads, working 2 episodes in advance here, I know. So Saturday in the Irish Independent review section, they will be talking about our guest this night. Next week, who's going to be Ronan Hession, the author of Leonard and Hungry Paul. Until then, see you on RT Gold weekday mornings from 10 a.m. on The Book Show on Radio 1 this coming Sunday at 7 p.m. as well. And back with Shelf Analysis with the bonus episode with John Banville. I will see you with that this coming Saturday at 3 o'clock. I hope you're there for it. And if not, you can watch it back at any stage. Listen, thanks a million for joining me. And I'll see you again. Good luck.